Welcome sleep, tired and really in need for sleep. You are watching boring history. You are floating now, not just in bed, but somewhere older, somewhere colder, a place built on salt and time. Tonight we step into a forgotten world, not of kings or castles, but of weathered hands on splintered oars, of distant stars mirrored in black water, of wooden ships creaking beneath woolen skies. These waters claimed countless vessels each year. Their icy grip could pull down a ship in moments, leaving behind nothing but debris and silence. Yet men returned to them again and again. Not for glory, but because the sea was life. Because the land could not feed them all. The wind had voices. Subtle shifts in its tone and weight could mean everything. They watched the flight of seabirds, the curling foam of waves, the sharpness of salt in the air. Navigation was a communion with nature. They charted their course by stars, by the angle of the sun, by the known silhouettes of far-off headlands. A skilled sailor could tell his position by the taste of seawater. Subtle variations in salt and temperature that spoke of river mouths, deep channels, or coastal swells. To most, these were invisible. To them, they were signs, warnings, whispers from a living sea. Provisions were simple, but life-sustaining. Salted fish, hardtack biscuits, like bricks, ale that resisted spoilage better than water. It was morale. It was a healer, knowing how to bind a wound or dress a burn with cloth soaked in oil. He was a mechanic of rope and wood, fashioning replacements for broken rigging or splintered beams with what little he had. In storm or silence, they moved as one, singing work songs to match the beat of oars, the creak of wood, the endless pull of sail and sea. It was memory. The best leaders understood their men, their breaking points, their strengths, their silences. They listened. They remembered. They knew that a sailor tired to the bone might hold the line not for pay, not for duty, but because he believed the man beside him would do the same. The crack of a biscuit might evoke thoughts of home. Salted meat reminded one of the smokehouse in the village. There were no graves but the deep. The dead were sewn into sailcloth, weighted with stone or iron, and committed to the water with prayers whispered through chattering teeth. Meals came at set hours, marked by the ringing of a bell or the call of the cook. Even in chaos, structure mattered. It kept minds steady, gave the illusion, sometimes, of control. Some sailors crossed themselves. Others held talismans or tokens from home, but all fell quiet in that moment. The sea, once fought and feared, became cradle and tomb. The lyrics, often ribald, often sacred, reminded them of the world beyond the waves. Some sang of saints who watched over sailors. Others sang of women left behind, of inns with warm firelight and softer beds. These songs filled the cold, the dark, the space between fear and fatigue. Perhaps they would sing, perhaps not. And then, as always, they would return to work. Because they were hardened, but because they had to be. These moments, however brief, gave warmth to the soul as well as the body. They caught what they could: herring, cod, mackerel, sometimes boiling them with seaweed or wrapping them in cloth soaked in vinegar. During good weather, they dried fish on the deck. On rare occasions, they celebrated with something fresh: a seabird caught by hand or rainwater collected in the sail. Deep blue was open ocean, safe from rocks, but not from storm. Sometimes the water would shift in a single day, a warning that the sea beneath them had turned unfamiliar. They knew to heave to, a strategy of surrender that allowed the ship to pause, facing the storm instead of challenging it. It was less a fight than a negotiation, between man and ocean, vessel and gale, because something inside them would not let them stay ashore. When storms rolled in, and they did, suddenly and often, the crew knew the rhythm of resistance. They tightened sails to ride the wind, never to fight it. They braced the mast, secured the barrels, and prayed. Not just for safety, but for steadiness, of hand, of mind, of will. And drop a comment. What city are you watching from, and what time is it? Sons of coastal villages where the cry of gulls was the sound of morning and the lull of waves was the rhythm of daily life. They knew the sea as one knows the mood of a loved one, through gesture, scent, silence, and storm. I want to picture exactly where you are as we step into this story together. A world where survival was stitched into every knot, every calloused palm, every whispered prayer to the sea. Their vessel, perhaps 30 feet long, was no more than curved oak planks held together by iron nails, woolen sails, and tar. It would look like a child's toy to modern eyes. Yet it carried the hopes of families, the memory of generations, and the courage of men who knew the risks. This is the story of medieval sailors, not the legends of grand explorers, but of the ordinary men who lived and died by wind, salt, and hope. So before we dive in, go ahead, hit that like button if this kind of wild historical storytelling is your thing. We begin in the North Sea, cold, unforgiving, yet endlessly traveled. These were not adventurers, they were survivalists. Fishermen, pilgrims, traders. They read the skies like holy texts. A certain thickness in the clouds told them more than any map. Consider a small crew setting out in winter from a harbor cloaked in fog. There were no instruments, no satellites overhead. They watched the water's color as one might study a face. Pale green hinted at hidden shoals or sandy bottoms. Survival was an endless dance of knowledge and adaptation. To steer was not merely to guide a ship, but to coax it, to keep it pointed into the wind, resisting panic and fatigue. Inside the vessel, life was spare, but food was not merely sustenance. Each sailor was more than a deckhand. He was a carpenter patching leaks with tar and sailcloth, and always he was a brother to the man beside him. There were no passengers on a medieval ship, only crew, only responsibility. Every hand mattered. Every voice had weight. These songs were not art, they were function. The rhythm kept the crew coordinated. Leadership was not measured in volume. Captain was not always the loudest voice. And when death came, as it often did, the sea received its own with solemn grace. The living would stand in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. The rhythm of the ship was sacred. Its watches rotated through day and night.
Was sacred. Watches rotated through day and night. Meals came at set hours, marked by the ringing of a bell or the call of the cook. Even in chaos, structure mattered. It kept minds steady. It gave the illusion sometimes of control. Religion traveled with them. Every voyage began with a blessing. Holy water sprinkled on deck, candles lit in a seaside chapel. Relics were kept in pockets, a saint's medal, a scrap of parchment, a wooden cross smoothed by touch. They prayed before storms. They prayed after. Some prayed even in calm, as if to keep the silence from becoming too loud. But they also believed in things older than Scripture, in omens, in signs. A gull flying inland might mean a gale. A sudden calm, unnaturally still, meant danger was coming. Whistling on deck was forbidden, for it was said to summon the wind, and not always the kind one wanted. The wet sails gleamed, the breath rose like smoke, and the men rose to stiff, sore, and still alive. And through it all, the cold, the wet, the strain, they endured. Some whispered stories, some whispered prayers, some stared into darkness and waited for dawn, because they had no other choice, because something in them was stronger than the storm, because they had each other. It was a test, a mirror, a teacher. But for now, breathe softly, that you are safe. In the darkest nights, they would lie awake below deck, listening to the groan of timbers, the slap of waves against hull. Habit not just for survival, but for sanity. A man could wake and see the same stretch of water he saw yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Time, unmarked, begins to unravel the mind. Days bleed into nights. Nights stretch into dreams that may never end. They rechecked lines. They mended tiers. They rotated the watch. 2 men, then 3, then 4, trading sleep in tight, stinking hammocks for silence and stars above. He might learn the safest route past the Scilly Isles from a tale that began. My uncle once saw 3 ships go down there in a single hour, not bound in leather, but carried in the voice. Each man knew his time would come, to stand alone on deck, to scan the horizon, to listen for shifts in the wind. When 20 men hauled a line together, their arms burned less if they sang, songs for mending sails and for bailing water. Each task had its tune, and when something broke that rhythm, a death, a storm, a moment of fear, the crew knew it must be mended, and those who had been at sea long enough could hum their way through an entire voyage. The pull of the rope matched the chorus. The verses were often nonsense or Bodhi or blessed. But it didn't matter. The rhythm was real. The rhythm was what mattered. Sometimes they spoke aloud, filling the damp air with tales passed down from older men, now long buried. They were maps of places and people, and dangers long forgotten. And for the youngest aboard, those who had never known anything but the village and the waves. They were education, lessons wrapped in wonder. A sailor who saw a city of gold on the horizon shining just before his death. A ghost ship with no crew sailing against the wind. A dolphin that followed one ship for months, only to vanish the day a storm swallowed them whole. No war, no news, no noise. Just creaking wood, soft waves, the slow breath of sails, and men sleeping where they can, dreaming of land. They boiled fish. They lived. When the sun returned, pale, golden, shy, it painted everything in forgiveness. That was enough. They washed their faces in salt water, and each day was a victory. For they had learned that the sea, vast and unknowable, was not their enemy. Not exactly. They respected it. They feared it. But they belonged to it too. And in their silent, weathered hearts, the sea belonged to them. Let this image hold you now. We'll continue shortly with more of their journey, their brotherhood, their superstitions, and the wisdom they carried like lanterns into the unknown. Drift with them, if you wish. There is room enough aboard thee. We're men of habit, these sailors. The sea has no borders, no landmarks, no end. And so the sailors made rituals. They rang the ship's bell at even intervals. It wasn't just duty, it was rhythm, a heartbeat, something to count on when the world below shifted constantly beneath your feet. And in those long hours, especially at night, they told stories. Sometimes they whispered, so as not to wake the hunters. These stories were more than entertainment. They were memory. A sailor might learn how to tie a storm not from a manual, but from a story about a man who saved his ship with one. And so the stories became scripture, not written, but sung. Work songs served a similar purpose. They weren't just for morale. They were coordination. There were songs for setting sail and songs for dropping anchor. In this way, song replaced clock. Story replaced chart, ritual. They built a world afloat, using memory and repetition. When a sailor died, he was not left to vanish.
No matter how hard the storm, no matter how short the time, the ritual was kept. The body sewn into sailcloth, a stone or piece of iron placed at the feet. The face, sometimes kissed, sometimes marked with ash. A prayer, even from those who had forgotten their faith. A spark in the wrong place could mean the death of every man aboard. So fire was watched, tended, feared, respected. No sailor was permitted to smoke without permission. No flame was left unwatched, and each man knew the price of carelessness. Cooking fires were built in metal boxes lined with sand. Every crew knew where the buckets of water were stored, and some ships kept barrels of soaked sand ready to smother any rogue flame. Then the drop, the splash, and silence. This act did something vital. It reminded the living they were still here. It marked the passing, gave shape to grief. In a world with no ground, these men made their own earth and called it tradition. They kept fires with care. Fire was warmth, light, and cooked food, but it was also terror. They held it, time and again. But the sea has a way of shrinking grudges. When your lives depend on each other, anger becomes a luxury you cannot afford. In rain, in darkness, with broken fingers and bleeding hands, it showed them who they were. Not in comfort, but in crisis. Not in calm, but in chaos. They held it, hung tokens from the rigging, avoided certain words, certain songs, certain dates. They would not sail on a Friday. They would not whistle. They would never cut their hair during a voyage. Fire was a silent threat, and so they gave it no excuse. Just as they learned to fear fire, they also learned to read signals. On land, you speak. At sea, you show. Others would join, not because they believed every word, but because the words gave rhythm, gave meaning. Ships spoke with flags, with sails, with movements. Some crossed themselves, some did both, and they knew how to wait. Faith was not consistent, but it was always present. The old sailor might slip half his ration to the youngest. He held a rope in one hand, a prayer in the other, and he waited. The captain might take the same bread as the crew, to remind them he was not above the storm. A changed sail pattern might say, "Storm ahead." A black flag might whisper, "Plague aboard." A square of bright color might offer, "We carry goods for trade." Two ships might pass and never come closer than a mile, yet they would speak. And at night, a lantern, swaying in a certain rhythm, could carry a message, a coded language of flame. You are not lost. More stories. It was a great wager, a constant gamble of risk and reward. Entrepreneurs of the most dangerous kind, risking everything, not for conquest or glory, but for survival and the dream of a better life. And nowhere was that more true than for the medieval merchant sailor. The ship itself was a treasure, its planks hewn from forest giants, its sailcloth thick and hand-stitched, its rope soaked in tar until black and stiff. Every part of the vessel was a labor, a cost, a debt, more rhythms. But for now, breathe, rest. The ship is steady, the crew is strong. You are drifting, gently, slowly, toward sleep. That a glance, a nod, a pull of rope could mean the difference between life and death. The sea taught them that silence could be louder than shouting. They were structure, they were comfort, they were control. Trust, on land, might be earned over years. On the sea, it was earned in hours. Because when the wind changes and the sails snap like thunder, you don't have time to ask questions. You need to know, without words, that the man beside you will hold the line. Each man knew his place, and he trusted the man beside him, and they did. This trust was not just practical, it was emotional, it was sacred. It was the thing that made a ship into a family. And yes, there were arguments, there were fights. When men are cold, wet, hungry, and frightened, tempers flare. They shared their food, even when there was little. They gave of what little they had, and in that, they found something larger than survival. They found meaning. Because the sea was more than a trial. It was a mirror. And so they developed beliefs, some written, some whispered. They spoke of sea spirits, of mermaids who warned or lured, of drowned men whose souls rose in the mist. They carved charms into the mast. These superstitions were not foolishness, because in a world where anything could happen, where storms could rise from nowhere and take everything, a charm around your neck could feel like a shield. Some prayed. In dark hours, the crew might huddle together, soaked and sleepless, and someone would begin a prayer, softly, and meaning in the endless sea was everything. The sailors who survived, who came home and told these stories, were not the strongest, not always. They were the ones who knew how to bend. A rigid mast snaps, a flexible one endures. They knew when to fight and when to surrender, when to push forward and when to drift. They knew how to read the signs, wait for the wind to shift, wait for the storm to pass, wait for the stars to return. And they always did. Eventually, they always did. So when you lie awake tonight, listening to the wind outside your own walls, remember this. Somewhere, centuries ago, a man stood on a swaying deck, watching that same moon, just as you wait now, just as we all do, in some way. The sea takes, the sea teaches, but it also gives. And tonight, it gives you rest. You are not alone. More awaits. Sleep, sailor, sleep. For the men aboard, The sea was not only a place of work. These men were not only mariners, they were investors. To launch a single voyage meant committing all you had and more. Then came the cargo. No matter how hard the storm, no matter how short the time, the ritual was kept. The body sewn into sailcloth, a stone or piece of iron placed at the feet, the face sometimes kissed, sometimes marked with ash, a prayer even from those who had forgotten their faith. A spark in the wrong place could mean the death of every man aboard. So fire was watched, tended, feared, respected. No sailor was permitted to smoke without permission. No flame was left unwatched, and each man knew the price of carelessness. Cooking fires were built in metal boxes lined with sand. Every crew knew where the buckets of water were stored, and some ships kept barrels of soaked sand ready to smother any rogue flame. Then the drop, the splash, and silence. This act did something vital. It reminded the living they were still here. It marked the passing, gave shape to grief. In a world with no ground, these men made their own earth and called it tradition. They kept fires with care. Fire was warmth, light, and cooked food, but it was also terror. They held it, time and again. But the sea has a way of shrinking grudges. When your lives depend on each other, anger becomes a luxury you cannot afford. In rain, in darkness, with broken fingers and bleeding hands, it showed them who they were, not in comfort, but in crisis, not in calm, but in chaos. They held it, hung tokens from the rigging, avoided certain words, certain songs, certain dates. They would not sail on a Friday. They would not whistle. They would never cut their hair during a voyage. Fire was a silent threat, and so they gave it no excuse. Just as they learned to fear fire, they also learned to read signals. On land, you speak. At sea, you show. Others would join, not because they believed every word, but because the words gave rhythm, gave meaning. Ships spoke with flags, with sails, with movements. Some crossed themselves, some did both, and they knew how to wait. Faith was not consistent, but it was always present. The old sailor might slip half his ration to the youngest. He held a rope in one hand, a prayer in the other, and he waited. The captain might take the same bread as the crew to remind them he was not above the storm. A changed sail pattern might say, "Storm ahead." A black flag might whisper, "Plague aboard." A square of bright color might offer, "We carry goods for trade." Two ships might pass and never come closer than a mile, yet they would speak. And at night, a lantern, swaying in a certain rhythm, could carry a message, a coded language of flame. You are not lost. More stories. It was a great wager, a constant gamble of risk and reward. Entrepreneurs of the most dangerous kind, risking everything, not for conquest or glory, but for survival and the dream of a better life. And nowhere was that more true than for the medieval merchant sailor. The ship itself was a treasure, its planks hewn from forest giants, its sailcloth thick and hand-stitched, its rope soaked in tar until black and stiff. Every part of the vessel was a labor, a cost, a debt, more rhythms. But for now, breathe, rest. The ship is steady. The crew is strong. You are drifting, gently, slowly, toward sleep. That a glance, a nod, a pull of rope could mean the difference between life and death. The sea taught them that silence could be louder than shouting. They were structure. They were comfort. They were control. Trust, on land, might be earned over years. On the sea, it was earned in hours. Because when the wind changes and the sails snap like thunder, you don't have time to ask questions. You need to know, without words, that the man beside you will hold the line. Each man knew his place, and he trusted the man beside him, and they did. This trust was not just practical, it was emotional, it was sacred. It was the thing that made a ship into a family. And yes, there were arguments, there were fights. When men are cold, wet, hungry, and frightened, tempers flare. They shared their food, even when there was little. They gave of what little they had, and in that, they found something larger than survival. They found meaning. Because the sea was more than a trial. It was a mirror. And so they developed beliefs, some written, some whispered. They spoke of sea spirits, of mermaids who warned or lured, of drowned men whose souls rose in the mist. They carved charms into the mast. These superstitions were not foolishness, because in a world where anything could happen, where storms could rise from nowhere and take everything, a charm around your neck could feel like a shield. Some prayed. In dark hours, the crew might huddle together, soaked and sleepless, and someone would begin a prayer, softly, and meaning in the endless sea was everything. The sailors who survived, who came home and told these stories, were not the strongest, not always. They were the ones who knew how to bend. A rigid mast snaps, a flexible one endures. They knew when to fight and when to surrender, when to push forward and when to drift. They knew how to read the signs, wait for the wind to shift, wait for the storm to pass, wait for the stars to return. And they always did. Eventually, they always did. So when you lie awake tonight, listening to the wind outside your own walls, remember this. Somewhere, centuries ago, a man stood on a swaying deck, watching that same moon, just as you wait now, just as we all do, in some way. The sea takes, the sea teaches, but it also gives. And tonight, it gives you rest. You are not alone. More awaits. Sleep, sailor, sleep. For the men aboard, the sea was not only a place of work. These men were not only mariners, they were investors. To launch a single voyage meant committing all you had and more. Then came the cargo.
A sailor growing too quiet, staring too long into the distance, laughing at things no one had said, sleeping less. They would begin to talk of cities beneath the sea, voices in the waves, of mermaids calling them home. Some jumped overboard, believing they could swim to shore, believing they could fly, core too much, forgetting tasks he once knew by heart. Speaking to ghosts, in some, the madness took root like a weed. The sea, like the mind, could calm again. The wise captains watched for these signs, of the way the sun rose over the eastern cliffs, of the church bells on feast days, of old friends in quiet gardens, and the scent of baking bread. Gently, quietly, they would shift the man's duties, pair him with another, give him rope to mend, sail to patch, something useful, of walking on something that didn't sway beneath them, of the first hot meal, of sleep in a still bed, of clean clothes and warm embraces. Tiny sparks of blue light danced in the ship's wake. The work of unseen life, stirred by motion. Sailors called it sea fire, others called it magic. It shimmered like stars, following behind them in silence. Larger than themselves, something real. Some men wept, some prayed, some simply stared upward, wordless. They cleaned the deck each morning, even if it had not rained. They said their prayers, even if they had long ago stopped believing, sometimes with fists, sometimes with silence, but always with the knowledge that they needed each other more than they needed to be right. It was not just trust, it was something beyond. They were men walking the edge of the world, and sometimes the man returned, a man who had held your hand while your brother slipped into the deep. These men were no longer strangers, they were kin. But it was not always madness, sometimes it was sorrow. deep, quiet sorrow for those left behind, for the children growing older without them, for the women they might never see again, for the land, green, solid, forgiving, that grew more like a dream with each passing week. The captain learned to read the signs, the muttered complaints, the slow-working hands, the refusal to sing. To survive such sorrow, they made rituals. With predictability, with a schedule kept, with stories shared, they kept the day marked even when the sky never changed, told stories not only to entertain, but to remember who they were. Stories of home. These memories were food for the soul, as vital as the salted meat, the ale, the hard biscuits they ate by hand, and tell the tale of a voyage longer than theirs, one that ended in glory, or at least survival. They also dreamed, not only in sleep but while awake. They dreamed of the day they would see land again, of the first footfall on a dock. These dreams were not foolishness, they were maps of hope. They guided the weary mind as surely as the stars guided the ship. They reminded each man that this journey had an end. But the sea taught another lesson too, that even in hardship, there could be beauty. Some nights, the ocean glowed, and on clear nights the stars above were so numerous, so sharp, that the sky seemed closer than the water. In those moments, they felt something larger than fear. They were not just sailors. The bond between them grew deeper with every wave. A man who had pulled you from the sea during a storm. A man who had shared his last bite of food. No one had to say it. It was known. And when conflict arose, as it always did in close quarters, it was resolved. Each man became part of a delicate balance. Too much noise and the crew grew restless. Too much silence and fear crept in. He responded not with punishment, but with rhythm. He might gather the men, pass around a cask of ale. These moments brought breath back to the crew. It reminded them that others had endured, and they would too. And when one of them was lost, claimed by storm, or sickness, or sorrow, the grief was felt by all. They held ceremonies not for show, but for healing, a prayer. To speak of it merely in wind speed and current charts is to miss its nature entirely. For sailors of the medieval world, the sea was alive, powerful, moody, and deeply aware. It could be merciful, it could be cruel, not with words, but with signs, with rituals, with quiet rules passed hand to hand, whispered from older mouths to younger ears, a small offering, a pact between ship and sea. Some kissed the wood, some closed their eyes and said the name of someone they loved, sealing them into the keel as a charm against loss. It could offer a mirror to the soul, or swallow a man without explanation. And so, to survive, sailors created their own language. You never mentioned rabbits. You never brought bananas. You never changed the name of a ship once it had sailed. Ships were named for saints, for wives, for humble creatures. The sea preferred modesty. It rewarded respect. A coin placed beneath the mast before the voyage began. Names mattered too. You never named a ship after something proud or boastful. That was an invitation for punishment. There were things you never did aboard ship. You never whistled. It might call the wind, and not the kind you could survive. And there were things you always did. Still others feared odd numbers and crew count, preferring an even hand to balance the soul of the voyage. A storm was coming. A dream of a child laughing. You would find good wind. A dream of drowning. There was the story of a sailor who saw lights dancing on the water and dove after them, turning hours later with hair turned white, saying nothing for the rest of his life. Best stay ashore if you could. Others relied on charms. Iron nails driven into the prow, teeth of whales, feathers of seabirds, coins rubbed smooth from the touch of generations. You saluted the first wave that struck the bow. You threw a scrap of bread to the gulls on your first day. That ships lost at sea did not disappear, but sailed on in the fog. Ghost ships, never docking. Their crew silent and eternal. You never left without touching the figurehead at the prow, usually a woman carved in flowing robes. Eyes forward, eternally watching. Some sailors swore she protected them. Others claimed she whispered warnings in dreams. There were sacred days, sacred colors, sacred numbers. Some ships never left port on a Friday. It was the day Christ died. To sail on it was to tempt fate. Others avoided the 13th day of any month. They watched for omens. If a gull followed the ship for more than a day, It meant a soul aboard would not return. If the sea turned suddenly still, with not a breath of wind, it was said to be watching, waiting to test you. Dreams mattered too, a dream of fire. And so, a map of belief grew. A belief that behind every swell was a spirit. That below the waves were cities of the dead, glowing with coral and bone. Stories filled the quiet. There was the tale of the weeping mermaid, who followed a ship for days, singing in sorrow, only to vanish before a gale took the mast. Some ships carried relics, bones of saints, splinters from holy crosses, vials of oil from sacred lamps. But not all was fear. Some men felt a joy in the strange. They saw dolphins as good omens, rainbows after rain as promises, shooting stars as greetings from loved ones long gone. The sea was, for them, not just danger, but wonder. Where else could you see clouds reflected perfectly, as if the sky were folding in on itself? Where else did silence stretch so far, so deep, it seemed to touch your bones? For where else could you see the moon sink into water? The sea offered something no land could, a confrontation with the invisible, and those who survived it. They carried that awareness back home. They walked differently, spoke slower, looked at the sky with old eyes, because they had heard things most would never understand, had felt the ocean's breath in their chest, had seen the dark beyond the stars. They came back with strange habits, old songs, small tokens worn on cords around their necks. They stared longer at the sky. They did not fear silence. And they knew the sea never truly left you. It changed your dreams. It lived in your skin. It called to you in the quiet. It was then that a man knew himself, not in battle, but in waiting. And even when your feet were on solid earth, part of you still swayed, gently forever. With the rhythm of the tide, keepers of memory, quiet watchers of the horizon, the sea had tested them, and they had listened. And somewhere in that listening, they had become something else. The soul of a sailor was not built in storms. It was forged in stillness. In the long hours, when no wind came, and the waves were glass, when the world turned soft and breathless, and those who sailed the sea did not return unchanged. Nobles, knights, pilgrims, emissaries, bishops, and even kings. Some called them superstitious. Others called them touched by the sea. But with trunks, retainers, body servants, and fine cloaks packed against the sea chill, his journey began in the counting house, not the tavern, with letters sealed in wax, with maps drawn by educated hands. But they knew, not just men, but vessels of story, and so the tales passed on, one to another, whispered under stars, murmured at docks, dreamed in the creak of timbers and the hush between waves. And even now, if you listen, truly listen, you might still hear them. Segment 4. The nobles at sea, pilgrims, lords, and the world above deck, while the common sailor slept on damp boards and mended torn sails with fingers split from salt and rope. Another world moved above them, slower, softer, wrapped in wool and silk. Not all who sailed were men of labor. There were those born to titles, to gold, to the weight of rings and names. And though they walked the same deck, their voyage was a different kind. When a nobleman prepared to sail, it was not with a single bundle of cloth and a prayer. He did not board the ship at dawn with a handful of salted fish and a lucky charm. He boarded with ceremony, with a procession of aids, perhaps even with musicians. His presence changed the ship. Its rhythm bent around him. Still heard the slap of waves against hull. Still smelled the bilge, the pitch, the salt. That no title could part the sea, the captain bowed lower. The crew grew cautious. Their voyage was not one of profit, but penance. They walked the deck barefoot. They prayed with each sunrise. They believed the sea might wash their sins clean. The air thickened with formality. Others had fought at sea, wearing mail beneath their surcoats, steering ships into battle with torch and axe. And yet the sea made no distinction. Hidden behind veils, guarded by servants, but watching everything. A storm tore through silk and sailcloth alike. And so, while the noble dined on roasted birds and candied nuts, seated beneath a canvas canopy above deck, he still swayed as the mast groaned. Sometimes when the sky darkened and the wind rose, he remembered something he had long tried to forget, that he was mortal, But not all nobles were soft. Some were seasoned crusaders who had crossed the Mediterranean under banners of faith and fire. Some were pilgrims, devout and sunburnt, bound for Santiago or Rome or the Holy Land. Still others were women, noble women, traveling for marriage, for inheritance, for diplomacy. They too learned the language of wind, the terror of waves, the long ache of waiting. And for a brief, briny moment in time, peasant and prince stood on the same deck, staring into the same horizon. Not of toil, but of strange ports, lavish gifts, curious encounters. They spoke of shipwrecks and rescues, of miraculous sightings, of prayers answered. Even aboard the finest ships, the sea taught equality. It humbled. It stripped away pretense. In the face of storm, every man bowed. Every woman clutched the railing. Every noble counted his blessings anew. And many, upon reaching land, kissed the earth. Not from pride, but from gratitude. Still, their voyage left a different mark. Where the common sailor returned home's sun, darkened and thinner, the noble returned with stories. And these stories, spoken in courts, in gardens and cloistered halls, shaped how the land imagined the sea. Paintings were commissioned, songs composed, and soon, even those who had never touched salt water began to dream of ships and distant shores. The sailor's hardship became the noble's poetry. But still, beneath it all, the truth remained. The sea did not care for station. It took whom it would, test it all. And for once, they were equals. When all is said and done, when the sails are furled and the harbor lies behind, it is not the roar of the wind that lingers. It is the silence between the waves. The soft breath of a man asleep on deck. The low murmur of an old story retold. The flicker of lamplight against wood, swaying with the sea's endless lull. These are the sounds that stay. For all who journeyed on those ancient ships, whether rough-handed sailor or cloaked noble, whether boy on his first voyage or captain on his last, carried something with them when they stepped ashore, not just the memory of storms or the ache of rope-bitten palms, but the deeper knowing. The knowing that they had been part of something vast, something older than kings, wilder than war, more eternal than stone. They had been embraced by the sea, and the sea, for all its tempers, all its tolls, had let them go. Not every man returned, it is true. Many remained forever in the deeps, their bones now cradled in sand, their names lost to wind and current. But even they are not forgotten, still echo in the creak of old hulls, still drift, quiet and invisible, through the dreams of those who listen.
Oh.
You may never taste salt from the air, or feel the groan of wood beneath a storm-filled sky, for their stories still ride the wind. You who have journeyed with us tonight may never set foot on a medieval ship, but something of them is now within you. Their patience, their wonder, their quiet bravery. Let it keep you steady, even as sleep pulls you deeper. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The water rests. The ship, too, rests. Adrift, not in danger now, but in peace. There are no more orders to shout, no more sails to haul. Just the soft breathing of the crew below, the hush of the sea beyond. And you held gently by history, by memory, by story. Held in stillness, held in sleep. May the journey be kind. May your dreams be full of light. May the wind be calm. Good night, traveler. And thank you for sailing with us. Even now, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts soften at the edges, the ship still rocks beneath you not in fear, but in comfort. For the ocean, when calm, is the oldest cradle. The waves sway as they always have, slow, deliberate, patient, not hurried, not sharp, just motion, gentle and eternal. And beneath that rhythm is something deeper still, a vast, ancient quiet. That quiet lives memory. Not written in books, not carved in stone, but carried in the hands of those who lived it. The sailor who tied knots in the dark, the helmsman who watched the stars each night and never spoke of the ones he loved back home, the cook who made broth from scraps and sang old songs no one remembered the words to, the boy who left shore with wide eyes and returned with lines on his face and salt in his blood. They are still here, you know. Not in name, not in form, but in this silence. In this story, the pull you sometimes feel when you hear a distant gull, or the wind hums in your window late at night. In the dreams where you stand barefoot on wood, feeling a deck shift gently under you. In this strange calm that comes when you think of nothing at all and everything all at once. The sea, after all, is not just water. It is memory. It is dream. It is the breath of centuries. And tonight, it surrounds you like a blanket, like a lullaby too old to trace. You are not adrift. You are carried. By voices long gone. By hands that once hauled rope and painted sails. By songs whispered to the wind, now returned as echoes. Drift with them, let the night take you as it once took them, not with fear, but with grace. Let each breath be an oar dipped in still water, each heartbeat a wave beneath you. You have nowhere to be now, nothing to do. The sea asks for nothing but rest, to sleep. Sleep like a sailor after landfall. Sleep like the tide pulling away from shore. Sleep knowing that even the wildest waves eventually come home.